Today, let's solve equations. How much is shaded? Let's make an estimate that is too high, about right, and too low. Okay, when we look at this, a too low equation might be 1 out of 16 pieces, because when we look here, there's half. Here we've divided it into fourths, and here we've divided it into eighths. So I would say that a too low would be 1/16. About right might be anywhere from a sixth to an eighth maybe. And a too high might be 1/4 or 1/2. So let's look at our picture here. If the pattern continues, what do you think the next diagram will look like? Well, here we have 1/8 and we have 2 rows and 4 in each row. Here we have 1/12 and we have 3 rows and 4 in each row. Here we have 4 rows, so we have 1/16. Here is 5 rows, and we have 1/20. So we have 2 rows, 3 rows, 4 rows, 5 rows. So our next one might have 6 rows with 4 in each row. So our next one would probably be 1/24. So what are we doing here? Well, we're counting by 4s. Okay, let's complete this table. Okay, so this one we have, let's look at this one as columns. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 columns. So we have a half of the first column. So one expression could be a half of one of the 4 columns. So a half times a fourth is 1/8. So we have 1/8 shaded. Another way that we could look at this is we could say there are 2 rows and we have 1/4 out of that row. So we could say 1 out of 4 out of one of the halves. So that still gives me an 1/8. Let's look at our second one. If we have 1, 2, 3, 4 columns and we have 1/3 out of that first column, one of our equations might be 1/3 out of 1 out of the 4 columns gives me a 12th. So let's look at it with rows. We have 3 rows, and out of the first row, I have 1/4 shaded. So I could say that's 1/4 out of one of the 3 columns. So that still gives me a 12th. So let's look at our next one. If we're looking at columns, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 columns. And out of the first column, I have 1/4 shaded. So one expression can be 1/4 out of one of the 4 columns gives me 1/16 shaded. So now let's look at it with rows. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. And out of the first row, I have 1/4 shaded. So I have 1/4 out of one of the 4 rows. So that equation is the same because we still have the same amount of rows and the same amount of columns. Okay, so 1/4 out of 1 out of the 4 columns. Let's look at D. Columns, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 columns. And out of the first column, we have 1/5. So 1/5 out of one of the 4 columns is 1/20. Okay, now let's look at it with rows. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 rows. Out of the first row, I have 1/4 shaded. So 1/4 out of one of the 5 rows gives me the 120. So what patterns do you notice in the table? Well, the denominators in the expressions tells us the number of rows and columns. All of the expressions have a 4th in them. And as the area of the blue rectangle gets smaller, the denominators get bigger because there's more pieces in the cake. Remember, the bottom is the denominator. That's the total pieces in the cake. So let's explain how this diagram represents the equation 1/4 times 1/6 equals 1/24. The square is divided into 6 rows and 4 columns. So 1/6 of one of the columns is shaded, and that's the same as 1 out of 24 pieces. So today we represented products of unit fractions with diagrams and with equations. How is multiplying unit fractions the same as multiplying whole numbers? How is it different? Well, we use the same multiplication facts to solve equations, but the answer is less than 1 whole because we're multiplying the denominators, not whole numbers. We use diagrams that show rows and columns to multiply whole numbers and unit fractions, but the rows and columns show fractions of 1 instead of more than 1. So when we look here, we have half of 1/6. So we would multiply our numerators and our denominators. 1 times 1 is 1. 2 times 6 is 12. Well, how do I know that 1/12 is less than 1 whole? Well, first of all, we're multiplying fractions, not whole numbers. And remember what your numbers and your fraction mean. The 1, your numerator, that one tells you how many pieces you get to eat. And your denominator tells you the total pieces in the cake. So I'm getting to eat only 1 piece out of a cake with 12 pieces. So I'm getting to eat less than 1 whole. So here is a picture of what your cake would look like. You are getting to eat 1 piece out of a cake with 12 pieces. So you're getting to eat less than 1 whole cake. If I was eating the whole cake, I would have to be eating how many pieces? Well, I would have to be eating all the pieces, so that means I would have to eat 12 out of the 12 pieces. That's the only way I'm getting the whole cake.